Chapter 1. Before Alaska was Alaska. Long before Alaska was a name, before it was even a land people could recognize, it was a place forged in fire and sculpted in ice. The ground beneath what we now call the last frontier is the product of a restless earth. Deep below the surface, tectonic plates collided, pushed, and folded the crust into mountains so tall that even today they rise above the clouds, capped with eternal snow. The Pacific plate slid and buckled beneath the North American plate, and in that grinding collision, Alaska was born. Volcanoes erupted with fury, spewing molten rock and ash into the sky, building land where there had been sea. At the same time, glaciers spread like white giants across the land, carving valleys, shaping fjords, and grinding stone into powder that would one day feed forests. This was not a gentle birth. It was violent, chaotic, and awe-inspiring, a creation worthy of myth. Imagine it tens of thousands of years ago. Great rivers of ice flowing slowly but unstoppably toward the sea, mountains like jagged teeth rising out of the earth, and volcanoes glowing red against a frozen horizon. Alaska was not just cold, it was alive with motion. Even today, earthquakes rumble beneath its soil, and volcanoes like Mount Redoubt and Mount Augustine remind us that this is a land never truly at rest. The same forces that shaped it in ancient times still breathe beneath the surface. A reminder that nature here is always in command. Yet amidst this raw, shifting landscape, life found a way. Mammoths with shaggy coats roamed the tundra, grazing on tough grasses and sedges. Saber-toothed cats stalked the herds of caribou, while giant bears lumbered through valleys. The Ice Age created bridges not just of stone and land, but of opportunity. For across the frozen expanse, connecting Asia to North America, a passage appeared. We know it today as Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge, a vast stretch of land exposed when sea levels dropped during the last great glacial period. It wasn't a narrow footpath, but an entire ecosystem, hundreds of miles wide, covered in grasslands, rivers, and wildlife. For millennia, it linked two continents like a natural highway. It was across this bridge that the first people came. We cannot know their names, for they left no written record, but they carried fire, tools, and stories in their minds. They followed the great herds, mammoth, bison, reindeer, driven by hunger and the eternal rhythm of survival. Step by step, generation by generation, families moved into this vast, cold land, setting foot on what would one day be Alaska. To them, it was not discovery, not conquest, but simply life unfolding forward, guided by the migrations of animals and the call of new horizons. Over thousands of years, these first peoples spread and settled, learning the ways of a land that demanded respect. They adapted to ice, to ocean, to mountain and tundra. They learned that survival required more than strength. It required knowledge. Which rivers froze last in winter, which plants held medicine, which animals could be hunted without destroying the balance of life. From this wisdom grew cultures as diverse as the landscapes they inhabited. On the northern coasts, where the Arctic Ocean stretches into endless white, the Inupiat people built lives on the rhythm of the sea. The whale was their lifeblood. Hunting bowhead whales from skin-covered boats, they took on a challenge as dangerous as it was vital. Every part of the whale had a purpose. Meat for food, blubber for oil, bone for tools. Nothing was wasted. For waste meant weakness, and weakness was death in such a harsh climate. Their skill was not only in hunting, but in community, for only together could they face the giants of the sea. Further to the south and west, along the shores of the Bering Sea, lived the Yupik. They too lived close to the ocean, relying on fish, seals, and birds. Their world was defined by the cycle of seasons, and their traditions reflected an understanding of nature's delicate balance. The Yupik held festivals to honor the spirits of the animals they hunted, believing that only through respect could the animals return, offering themselves again to the people. Their dances and masks told stories of creation, survival, and the ever-present relationship between humans and the natural world. Out on the windswept Aleutian Islands, where storms sweep across the Pacific and volcanoes rise from the sea, the Aleut people made their homes. They were master sea hunters, navigating dangerous waters in sleek skin boats called bidarkas. With skill and daring, they pursued sea otters, seals, and sea lions, clothing themselves in the rich furs of the animals they hunted. To outsiders, it seemed impossible that anyone could live in such a rugged chain of islands, battered by constant wind and rain. But the Aleuts thrived. Their society was rich in artistry and craftsmanship, with clothing so finely sewn from seal gut that it repelled water better than modern raincoats. To the southeast, where Alaska's jagged coastline turns into a maze of islands and fjords, lived the Tlingit and Haida. Their world was one of towering cedar forests and abundant salmon runs. These peoples built great wooden houses and carved totem poles that told the histories of clans, ancestors, and spirits. Their society was structured around clans and lineages, with wealth measured not only in possessions, but in generosity. In the grand potlatches where leaders gave away goods to demonstrate power and prestige. They were traders, warriors, and artists, their canoes carrying them along the waterways that were highways of their world. Unlike the harsh, sparse north, their environment was rich, and from it they built a culture both strong and sophisticated. In the interior, far from the coasts, the Athabascans lived in the vast boreal forests and river valleys. Their world was one of rivers that froze hard in winter and swelled with salmon in summer. They were hunters and gatherers, moving with the seasons, their lives tied to moose, caribou, and fish. Their knowledge of the land was profound. They knew how to read the signs of animals, the changing of the weather, the subtle cues of survival in a land where mistakes could be fatal. Their stories were carried in oral traditions, passed from elders to children, teaching not only history, but the values of endurance, cooperation, and respect for nature. These were not scattered bands living in isolation, but peoples who knew of each other, who traded, fought, and sometimes intermarried. Seashells from the Pacific could find their way deep into the interior, carried along trade routes that spanned hundreds of miles. Stories and songs traveled too, weaving together a tapestry of human life across Alaska long before the arrival of outsiders. Though each group developed its own language, customs, and ways of life, they all shared one truth. Alaska demanded respect, and those who gave it found a way to endure. This land was not easy. Winters were long and dark, summers short but intense with swarms of insects. The ground could be frozen solid or swampy and treacherous. Storms came without warning, rivers flooded, and food supplies could vanish in a bad season. But these peoples were resilient. They built not just shelters, but homes filled with meaning. They developed tools of remarkable ingenuity, harpoons with toggling heads that held fast in the flesh of sea mammals, snowshoes that allowed them to walk across deep drifts, sleds drawn by dogs that became companions as well as workers. Their art, from carved ivory to woven baskets, was not decoration alone, but carried stories, spirits, and teachings. What is remarkable is not that they survived, but that they thrived, creating cultures of richness and depth in one of the world's harshest environments. To live here was to live in balance. Every hunt was also a prayer, every tool an extension of the natural world. The land and sea were not resources to be exploited, but relatives to be honored. This worldview shaped not only daily survival, but the very identity of Alaska's first peoples, binding them to their environment in ways that resonate even today. When we think of Alaska now, we may picture snow-capped peaks, bears fishing for salmon, or endless wilderness untouched by human hand. But the truth is, humans have been part of this land story for tens of thousands of years. They were not intruders, but participants in a grand cycle of life, shaping and shaped by the glaciers, the seas, the forests, and the animals. Alaska was not waiting to be discovered. It was already known, lived in, and loved. And so, by the time the first distant sails appeared on the horizon many centuries later, Alaska was no untouched wilderness. It was a homeland, rich with people, cultures, and histories that had endured since the age when fire and ice still fought to define the land. Chapter 2. Spirits of the North. When we think of Alaska before European contact, we must put aside the idea of an untouched wilderness, waiting for someone to step into it. By the time distant ships would one day approach its shores, Alaska was already alive with stories, traditions, and networks that stretched far beyond the horizon. It was a land where the people who had crossed over generations earlier had not only survived, but had made it their own, carving out identities rooted in the cold, the sea, and the sky. They had learned that life in the North was not about bending nature to human will, but about listening, adapting, and moving in harmony with the rhythms of the seasons. The world of the Inupiat, the Yupik, the Aleut, the Tlingit, the Haida, the Athabascans, and others was one in which every day was both fragile and profound. Winter could kill the unprepared in hours, but summer brought abundance so great it seemed the land itself was making up for its harshness. Salmon ran in rivers in such numbers that the water seemed alive with silver. Caribou moved across the tundra in great herds, offering meat, hides, and bone for tools. The ocean, though dangerous and unforgiving, was a highway of life, carrying seals, walrus, whales, and seabirds to the people who had mastered the skills to take them. But survival in such extremes was never only about food. It was about knowledge. Knowledge passed down not in books, but in stories. Stories carried in memory and spoken aloud by firelight or beneath the endless summer sun. These were oral traditions that connected generations, that preserved not just facts of where to find game or when to plant roots, but deeper truths about how to live. To hunt a whale, one had to know its habits, but also its spirit. To fish for salmon, one had to understand not only the run of the river, but the cycles of return, the belief that salmon offered themselves if honored properly. The myths of Alaska's peoples were not myths in the sense of fanciful tales detached from reality. They were instructions for life, encoded wisdom carried in the voices of elders. The Inupiat told of the raven, a figure both trickster and creator, who brought light into the world and shaped the land with cunning and mischief. The Yupik had stories of spirits inhabiting every corner of existence, from the animals they hunted to the winds that howled across the tundra. For the Tlingit and Haida, the totem poles carved from cedar were not decorations, but histories in wood, recording the lineages, alliances, and deeds of ancestors, as well as the presence of the supernatural in daily life. In these traditions, The line between the human and natural worlds was thin, sometimes non-existent. The Aleutians believed the sea otter possessed human-like qualities and treated it with respect, sewing garments from its pelts that were both practical and spiritual. Hunters spoke to the animals they pursued, asking permission, offering thanks. The Athabascans of the interior passed down legends of giant animals and spirit beings that roamed the forests, reminders that the unseen world was as real as the physical one. These stories bound people to their environment, teaching respect, humility, and caution. They were not only entertainment, but survival guides, moral codes, and cultural maps. Imagine, for a moment, the scene. Winter has set in. The wind roars outside a snow house or wooden shelter. Families huddle together, firelight flickering on faces as an elder begins to speak. The children lean closer, their breath visible in the cold air. The elder's voice carries the weight of centuries, of ancestors who faced the same cold, who hunted the same animals, who feared the same storms. The story might be about ravens stealing the sun, or about the first caribou hunt, or about a shaman who could walk between worlds. But beneath the tale is always the same message. We are part of this land, and to live here, we must listen to it. And listening meant more than hearing the wind. It meant noticing the way snow drifted against a slope, which told where the caribou might pass. It meant reading the stars to guide canoes across treacherous waters. It meant observing the ice, learning when it would break, when it would hold, and when it would betray. To survive in Alaska before European contact was to develop senses honed not only by necessity, but by culture. Children were taught early to watch, to memorize, to pay attention, because forgetting could mean death. Yet despite the harshness, there was beauty, and there was celebration. Festivals and gatherings brought people together, binding communities with song, dance, and ritual. The Yupik Bladder Festival honored the souls of seals that had been hunted, returning their spirits to the sea so they might be reborn. Potlatches among the Tlingit and Haida were moments of generosity and prestige, where wealth was given away to affirm power and relationships. The rhythm of life was not only about endurance, but about meaning. Finding joy, creating art, and weaving human existence into the broader pattern of nature. What often surprises those who imagine pre-contact Alaska as isolated is the truth that these communities were connected through vast and complex trade networks. From the Arctic coasts to the Pacific Northwest, goods moved along routes that stretched for thousands of miles. Obsidian from volcanic sources in Alaska could end up in tools far inland. Copper, prized for its rarity, was traded among the Tlingit, carried great distances, and worked into ornaments and weapons. Dentalium shells from the Pacific coast traveled north, used as decoration and currency. Even in the frozen north, where life was a constant struggle, people found time and energy for exchange, for creating systems of value and connection that transcended distance. These trade routes were not simple exchanges of goods. They were threads of culture, carrying stories, songs, and ideas along with materials. Marriages between groups cemented alliances, while feasts and ceremonies brought distant peoples together. A shell found in the hands of an Athabascan hunter might have passed through dozens of hands before it reached him, linking him in unseen ways to people he would never meet. The sea and the rivers were highways, and the people of Alaska knew how to use them, carving sleek canoes from cedar, building skin boats that danced on the waves, traveling with skill and daring. For outsiders, it is easy to underestimate the sophistication of these systems. The absence of writing sometimes leads to the false impression that these cultures were static, simple, or undeveloped. In truth, they were dynamic, flexible, and deeply intelligent in ways adapted precisely to their environment. Their oral traditions were libraries, their rituals were political systems, their trade routes were economies that bound communities across thousands of miles. To live without books or metal coins was not to live without knowledge or wealth. It was to live with knowledge stored differently, in memory, in practice, in the shared experiences of generations. If one could step into that world before the arrival of Europeans, one would not find empty silence. One would hear drums, chants, the crackle of fire, the sound of paddles dipping into water, the laughter of children chasing each other across the snow. One would see the flicker of oil lamps, the glint of carved ivory charms, the glow of faces painted for ceremonies. One would feel the pulse of life that moved with the cycles of fish and game, of storms and thaws, of birth and death. It was a world in which humans were never truly alone. Spirits were everywhere, in the animals, the mountains, the sky. To live was to be in constant relationship, negotiating not only with neighbors, but with the unseen. Shamans held powerful roles, mediating between worlds, healing the sick, ensuring the success of hunts. Dreams were taken seriously, omens read with care. The material and spiritual were not separate, they were one. And yet, even as these societies flourished, change was always close at hand. The land itself demanded adaptability, and the people of Alaska proved endlessly capable of it. They moved when resources dwindled, adjusted tools to new conditions, shifted stories as new experiences were gained. This adaptability was their strength. For millennia, it kept them alive through ice ages, storms, and famines. It allowed them to build networks that stretched beyond their immediate world, to trade and share across distances that would have daunted others. When Europeans finally did arrive, drawn by fur and fortune, they encountered not an empty land, but one filled with people whose lives were already rich, whose traditions stretched back further than they could imagine. A land where stories were maps, where trade was diplomacy, where survival was art. But that encounter belongs to another part of Alaska's story. For now, before the sails appeared, before new diseases and weapons and religions changed everything, Alaska was a place alive with its own spirits. The spirits of the North were in the ice, in the sea, in the animals, and in the people who had learned to thrive there. It was a world entire unto itself, vast and self-sustaining, waiting unknowingly on the edge of a transformation that would reshape it forever. Chapter 3. Russia's Great Gamble. The world of Alaska's native peoples, with its cycles of abundance and hardship, its stories and trade networks, carried on for millennia without interruption from across the seas. But in the 18th century, sails appeared on the horizon, and with them came men who viewed the land in a very different way. For the Russian Empire, Alaska was not a homeland, not a spiritual landscape bound by myth and tradition, but a gamble, a far-off frontier that might yield riches if they were bold enough to seize them. The story began with Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, who dreamed of expanding his empire's knowledge and power. Before his death in 1725, he ordered an ambitious expedition to the far east of his vast domain. His instructions were clear. Find out whether Siberia was connected to North America and explore what lay beyond. It was not curiosity alone that drove him, but the hunger for resources, for new lands, and for the prestige of discovery. The man chosen to lead this mission was Vitus Bering, a Danish navigator in Russian service. His first voyage in 1728 confirmed that Siberia and America were separated by water, though the fog and storms kept him from sighting the American shore. But the stage was set. It was on Bering's second expedition, launched in 1741, that Russia first laid eyes on Alaska. Bering's ship, the St. Peter, and another vessel, the Saint Paul, crossed the Pacific from Kamchatka. The journey was brutal. Storms battered the ships, scurvy weakened the crews, and supplies dwindled. Yet through fog and uncertainty, they pressed on. In July of that year, they sighted land. Towering mountains, forested shores, and the promise of a new world of opportunity. It was Alaska, though the explorers could not yet grasp the scale of the place they had reached. Bering himself would not live to see the venture's fruits. He died of illness on a remote island during the return voyage. But word of what his men had seen reached Russia, and with it came reports of an animal whose pelt was finer, warmer, and more valuable than anything known in Europe. It was not gold or silver that drew Russia deeper into Alaska, but fur, specifically, the fur of the sea otter. The sea otter's pelt was astonishingly dense, with hair so thick that water could not penetrate. In China's markets, where luxury was measured in rarity, sea otter pelts fetched prices higher than gold. Russian traders, known as promyshlenniki, realized quickly that fortunes could be made if they could control the hunting of these animals. And so began Alaska's fur trade, a chapter that would transform native communities and set the course of Russian America. The Russian hunters were rough men, hardened by Siberia's harshness and driven by greed. They crossed the Bering Sea in small boats, landing on Aleutian islands where they encountered the Aleut people. At first, there may have been curiosity on both sides, but it did not take long for violence and exploitation to take hold. The promyshlenniki demanded labor, forcing Aleut hunters to gather sea otters for them. If villages resisted, the Russians burned them, killed men, and took women and children as hostages to ensure obedience. The Aleuts, who had mastered the dangerous seas for countless generations, now found themselves compelled to hunt not for survival or tradition, but to satisfy the quotas of strangers. The impact was devastating. Sea otter populations plummeted under relentless hunting, disrupting ecosystems and leaving the Aleuts vulnerable. Communities fractured under the strain, their old rhythms of life torn apart by foreign demands. Diseases carried across the sea, against which the native peoples had no immunity, cut down entire villages. A way of life that had endured storms, famines, and ice ages now faced a new threat: the insatiable hunger of an empire for profit. And yet, despite the brutality, there was also resilience. Aleut hunters, under duress, used their extraordinary skills to harvest sea otters in numbers the Russians themselves could never have achieved. They navigated treacherous waters, braved storms, and returned with pelts that filled Russian holds. It was a cruel irony. The very abilities that had once sustained them were now turned against their own freedom. The Russians built posts and small settlements, establishing footholds in the Aleutians and beyond, gradually pushing eastward. By the late 18th century, Russia's presence in Alaska had solidified into more than scattered hunting camps. In 1799, Tsar Paul I granted a charter to the Russian-American Company, giving it monopoly rights over the fur trade in Alaska. Modeled after the powerful trading companies of Britain and the Netherlands, the Russian-American Company effectively ruled Alaska on behalf of the empire. Its headquarters were established at Novoarkhangelsk on Sitka Island, and from there it administered Russian America with an iron hand. Novoarkhangelsk was not a grand capital, but a rough settlement of log buildings and fortifications, surrounded by the dense forests and misty waters of southeast Alaska. Yet it was the center of power for Russia's gamble, a place where ships arrived from across the Pacific, where traders haggled, and where native peoples found themselves pulled deeper into a world not of their making. The Tlingit, whose homeland included Sitka, resisted fiercely. In 1802, they attacked the Russian settlement, killing many and driving the rest away. But the Russians returned with reinforcements and superior weapons, crushing resistance and rebuilding their fort stronger than before. The clash at Sitka was emblematic of the larger story. Native determination to defend their lands and cultures met with the relentless push of empire. For the Russians, Alaska was never an easy colony. The distances were immense, supplies scarce, and profits uncertain. Every barrel of flour, every musket, every nail had to be shipped thousands of miles across rough seas. Yet the lure of fur kept them there, and the demand in China kept prices high. Native labor was indispensable, and so the Russians relied on coercion and control, using hostages, forced relocations, and alliances with some groups against others. The cultural impact was profound. Missionaries followed the traders, bringing Orthodox Christianity, which took root in some communities even as others resisted. Intermarriage between Russian men and native women created new families, new identities, and sometimes new tensions. But beneath all of this lay a darker truth. The land was being emptied of its riches. Sea otters, once abundant, were driven to the edge of extinction. Foxes, seals, and other fur-bearing animals were trapped in staggering numbers. What had once been a balance between people and nature, maintained over countless generations, was overturned by the relentless appetite of the market. For the native peoples of Alaska, the arrival of the Russians was not just the appearance of new faces, but the beginning of upheaval, of epidemics and exploitation that reshaped their worlds. And yet, in the midst of this, life went on. Villages rebuilt, families adapted, traditions were kept alive in secret or in new forms. The songs and stories continued to be told, even as the context changed. Some communities embraced aspects of Russian culture, integrating Orthodox rituals into their own practices, while others held fiercely to their old ways. Survival, as always in Alaska, required resilience, and the peoples of the land drew on deep reserves of strength. For Russia, the gamble of Alaska was both success and burden. The fur trade brought wealth, but at high cost. The colony never became self-sustaining, always dependent on supplies from afar. Harsh conditions, hostile encounters, and the sheer difficulty of ruling such a distant land strained the empire's resources. Yet Alaska remained under the double-headed eagle of Russia, a foothold in the New World, a testament to ambition and risk. It was a fragile empire on the edge of the world, built on the backs of native hunters and balanced precariously between profit and collapse. But for the moment, Russian America stood, a reminder that even in the farthest reaches of ice and storm, the hunger of empires could reach, leaving scars that would last for centuries. Chapter 4. The American Purchase. By the middle of the 19th century, Russia's gamble in Alaska was showing cracks. The fur trade that had once poured riches into the coffers of the Russian-American Company had begun to dwindle, Sea otters, hunted relentlessly for their prized pelts, were nearly gone from many shores. The distance from St. Petersburg to Sitka was too vast, the supply lines too fragile, and the costs too high for the colony to thrive. Russia, stretched thin across a massive empire and facing pressures in Europe and Asia, began to view its American outpost not as a jewel, but as a burden. And so, the stage was set for a transaction that would forever change the destiny of the land. In the aftermath of the Crimean War, Russia feared losing Alaska not to commerce, but to conflict. Britain, already entrenched in Canada, loomed as a potential adversary. If another war came, Alaska, undefended and isolated, might be seized without a fight. Better, the Russian leaders reasoned, to sell it on their own terms, while it still held value. And in the United States, across the continent, there were men who dreamed of expanding America's borders ever farther. Among them was William Henry Seward, Secretary of State under President Andrew Johnson, a man of ambition and vision, who saw in Alaska not an icy wasteland, but a land of possibility. Negotiations began quietly, far from the public eye. The Russian minister to the United States, Edward de Stuckel, entered into talks with Seward in Washington. Both men understood the stakes. Russia needed to rid itself of a costly outpost, and Seward, eager to demonstrate American strength after the Civil War, longed to secure a triumph that would prove his country's reach. The discussions moved quickly. On the night of March 29, 1867, in Seward's home, the agreement was struck. By the early hours of March 30th, the treaty had been signed. For $7.2 million, roughly 2 cents an acre, the United States had purchased Alaska. The reaction was not what Seward had hoped. Instead of being celebrated as a statesman of foresight, he was ridiculed. Newspapers scoffed at the deal, calling the new territory Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox. Politicians mocked the idea of spending millions on a frozen wilderness, a land of glaciers and polar bears, thousands of miles from the settled parts of the nation. Some wondered aloud if the secretary had lost his mind. What good was Alaska, they asked, except as a place for walruses to sun themselves and fur traders to freeze? The ridicule was biting, and it stung Seward deeply. Yet he remained steadfast, convinced that history would vindicate him. He saw what others could not. Alaska's vast coastline, its fisheries, its timber, and the potential of resources hidden beneath its mountains and tundra. He believed that America's future lay not only in its farms and cities, but in its ability to command oceans and trade routes. In his mind, Alaska was not folly, but foresight. On October 18, 1867, the official transfer took place in Sitka, the capital of Russian America. The scene was symbolic and solemn. Russian soldiers lowered the imperial flag of the double-headed eagle, and American soldiers raised the stars and stripes in its place. Cannons fired in salute. The Russians, some with tears in their eyes, knew they were watching the end of an era. For more than a century, they had struggled and bled on this land, and now it was gone. For the Americans, there was a sense of triumph, though few truly understood the immensity of what they had just acquired. For the native peoples of Alaska, however, this ceremony was not a celebration. They had not been consulted, nor had their voices been heard. Their lands, their seas, their worlds had been handed from one empire to another, as though they were objects in a marketplace. To them, it was not Seward's folly or Russia's triumph, but another turn in a story of outsiders claiming dominion over a homeland that had never been empty. The transition to American rule was not immediate or smooth. The first years after the purchase were marked by uncertainty. The U.S. Army administered the territory at first, but it was a distant and often indifferent presence. American settlers were few, drawn mainly by curiosity or the hope of opportunity. The Russians who remained, many of them tied by marriage or heritage to native communities, faced the choice of leaving for a homeland that was no longer theirs, or staying in a land that no longer welcomed them as rulers. American soldiers and officials, unfamiliar with the cultures and conditions of Alaska, often clashed with the native peoples. Where the Russians had at least established a system, however harsh, of trade and control, the Americans brought disorganization. The Army lacked resources to govern effectively, and corruption sometimes flourished. Yet slowly, new patterns emerged. Traders from the United States began to replace Russian merchants. Missionaries arrived, eager to spread their faith and reshape native lives according to their beliefs. The flag may have changed, but for the indigenous peoples, the intrusion of outsiders remained the same. Disruption, disease, and demands that were not of their choosing. Despite the ridicule in Washington, the sheer scale of Alaska began to capture imaginations. Maps shaded the territory in broad strokes, reminding Americans that they had extended their borders to the very edge of the continent. Sailors recognized its strategic importance, sitting astride the northern Pacific, within reach of Asia. Scientists marveled at its glaciers, mountains, and wildlife. And though few yet guessed the treasures hidden in its ground, whispers of possibility began to grow. Furs still held value, and fisheries promised wealth. But it was the sense of expansion itself, the idea that America's destiny had grown larger, that gave the purchase a quiet power. Seward, ever confident, told his critics that they would one day thank him. He believed Alaska would become one of the most important regions of the nation, a place whose resources and position would secure America's prosperity. At the time, such words sounded grandiose, even foolish. But in the years to come, as discoveries unfolded and the world's attention shifted, his vision would prove far closer to the truth than his detractors imagined. Still, the immediate years were not golden. Alaska remained isolated, sparsely populated, and largely ignored by the wider country. Few settlers rushed north, and those who did often found hardship rather than fortune. Supplies were costly, winters unforgiving, and opportunities limited. The Army's governance was temporary, later replaced by the Treasury Department's administration of customs, and eventually by the Navy. It was a patchwork of authority, never fully stable, often resented by those it sought to govern. For Alaskans, native, Russian, and the few new American arrivals alike, it was a period of confusion, a limbo between empires. But the land itself remained, vast and unyielding, holding secrets the world had yet to uncover. The mountains stood watch, the rivers carried salmon, the tundra stretched silent beneath the aurora. The peoples who had lived there since time immemorial continued their traditions, even as change pressed in around them. They adapted as they always had, drawing on resilience forged in generations of survival. And slowly, the United States, though clumsy and uncertain at first, began to realize that what it had acquired was no folly at all, but something far greater. In the decades to come, events would transform Alaska's image from a frozen curiosity into a land of immense wealth and strategic importance. But in 1867, In the months and years after the purchase, it was still largely a mystery. Mocked in the press and misunderstood by the public, Seward bore the brunt of the ridicule. But he carried it with a conviction that history was on his side. Looking back, it is easy to smile at the scorn of the skeptics. They could not know what oil and gold and fisheries would mean, nor could they imagine the role Alaska would one day play in war and commerce. To them, it was a gamble too absurd to justify. To Seward, it was a vision of the future. And as time passed, the folly would fade and the foresight would shine. But that is another part of Alaska's long story. For now, in the aftermath of the Russian flag coming down and the American flag going up, Alaska had entered a new chapter, its destiny tied not to the czars of St. Petersburg, but to the United States of America. Petersburg, but to the stars and stripes of a nation still unsure of what it had truly gained. Chapter 5. Gold Fever. For years after the American flag was raised over Sitka, Alaska remained something of a forgotten possession. Far from the centers of power, sparsely populated and costly to administer, it lingered in the minds of most Americans as little more than a cold curiosity. The taunts of Seward's Folly and Seward's icebox seemed justified. But the land had secrets, and in the 1890s, one of those secrets burst into the world with a fury that would forever change the destiny of Alaska. The secret was gold. Gold has a way of rewriting history. It is not just a metal, not merely a medium of exchange, but something closer to a fever in the human mind. From the rivers of California to the mountains of South Africa, its discovery sparks migrations, dreams, and chaos in equal measure. And so it was with the Klondike. In 1896, along a small tributary of the Yukon River in Canada's remote northwest, gold was found in astonishing quantities. The news spread slowly at first, carried by word of mouth and whispered rumors. But when miners returned to Seattle and San Francisco with sacks of glittering nuggets, the world erupted. Headlines screamed of fortunes waiting to be scooped from the streams. "Gold! Gold in the Klondike!" cried the papers. And with that cry, a stampede began. Tens of thousands of men and women, from farm boys and clerks to hardened prospectors, set their eyes on the frozen north. They sold what little they had, abandoned jobs and families, and poured into ports like Seattle, where outfitters made fortunes selling supplies to the dreamers. Alaska became the gateway to the Klondike. From coastal towns like Skagway and Daya, the stampeders began their long and brutal journey inland. Few had any idea of what awaited them. The journey was not a march, but a trial of endurance and madness. To reach the Klondike, prospectors had to cross mountain passes that seemed designed to break the human spirit. The Chilkoot Pass, rising steeply above Daya, became a vision seared into history. Endless lines of men trudged upward in single file, each carrying a heavy load on his back, stepping into the footprints of the man ahead. The Canadian government required each prospector to bring a year's worth of supplies, close to a ton of goods, to prevent mass starvation in the wilderness. This meant dozens of trips up and down the icy slope, bodies straining beneath sacks of flour, bacon, and picks. In winter, avalanches swept men to their deaths. In spring, melting ice turned trails into rivers of mud. Yet the fever drove them on. For those who survived the passes, the Yukon River lay ahead. Boats had to be built from scratch, hammered together from green timber, to carry the stampeders down treacherous rapids toward Dawson City, the heart of the Klondike. Some never made it. Their boats smashed against rocks, their dreams drowned in the cold water. But for those who did arrive, Dawson was a sight both wondrous and wretched. What had once been a sleepy trading post had exploded into a boomtown of saloons, gambling halls, and muddy streets crowded with tents and shacks. Fortunes were won and lost in a single night at the gaming tables, in the price of a claim, or in the bottom of a gold pan. The fever did not discriminate. Among the stampeders were hardened prospectors. Yes, but also lawyers, teachers, farmers, even society women who traded lace for furs and took their chances in the wilderness. Jack London, still a young man, came north and found in the harsh struggle the raw material for the stories that would make him famous. Others, less fortunate, left only bones beneath the snow. Death was a constant companion. From cold, from hunger, from accidents, from violence. Yet still they came, drawn by the promise that somewhere in the gravel of a frozen stream lay the chance of a lifetime. But if Alaska was the gateway to the Klondike, it soon had its own gold to offer. In 1898, news broke that rich deposits had been found on the beaches of Nome, on Alaska's western coast. Unlike the distant Klondike, Nome was within Alaska's borders, and the gold was in the very sand of the beaches. Here, no dangerous mountain passes stood in the way. A man could walk off a ship, scoop up the sand, and find gold. It was too irresistible to ignore. Another stampede began, this time pouring directly into Alaska itself. Nome was chaos incarnate. Within months, thousands of tents dotted the shoreline, and a city sprang from nothing, filled with every imaginable character. Honest miners worked side by side with gamblers, swindlers, and opportunists of every stripe. Claim jumping was rampant. Men would stake ground at night, only to find it stolen by morning. The law was weak, often bought or ignored, and the town swirled with vice. Saloons blazed with light and noise, while outside, men dug feverishly in the sand, their dreams of wealth clashing with the hard reality of exhaustion and disappointment. Some grew rich, but most did not. For every man who struck it big, dozens left broken, penniless, and bitter. The Nome Rush revealed the truth of all gold rushes. That fortune often flowed not to the miners, but to those who sold to them. Merchants, saloon keepers, shipping companies, and con men grew rich, while the stampeders carried the weight of hunger, cold, and dashed hopes. Yet the fever persisted, for hope is harder to kill than flesh. And while most failed, the few who succeeded were enough to keep the dream alive for all. These rushes transformed Alaska. Once dismissed as a useless wilderness, it now stood in the American imagination as a land of opportunity and adventure. Newspapers that had once mocked Seward's Folly now ran breathless accounts of strikes and fortunes. Men who had never heard of the Chilkoot Pass now spoke of it as though they had trudged it themselves. Alaska was no longer a curiosity on a map. It was a place of legend, where hardship and wealth walked hand in hand. Economically, the gold rushes brought new life to the territory. Boomtowns rose and fell, leaving behind scars, but also infrastructure. Trails were carved, docks built, telegraph lines strung across vast distances. The influx of people, even if temporary, brought attention and investment. Alaska was no longer ignored in Washington, for the potential of its wealth was now undeniable. Though most prospectors failed, the rushes seeded towns and industries that would endure long after the fever had passed. Culturally, the rushes stamped Alaska with an identity that still lingers. The image of the prospector, bent beneath his pack, doggedly trudging through snow toward a distant dream, became a symbol of the frontier spirit. Alaska was seen as a place for the bold, the reckless, the desperate, those willing to risk everything for a chance at fortune. It attracted not only Americans from the lower 48, but also immigrants from Europe, Asia, and beyond, giving the territory a diverse character. Swindlers and saints, adventurers and dreamers, all left their mark on the land and its memory. Yet the rushes also deepened the challenges for Alaska's native peoples. For them, the arrival of tens of thousands of outsiders meant displacement, disruption, and new waves of disease. Traditional lands were overrun, game was driven away, and new systems of law ignored their rights. Where once their lives had been shaped by the rhythms of nature, they now faced the chaos of boomtown economies and foreign demands. Some adapted, working as guides, traders, or laborers, but many were left struggling to survive in a world being reshaped around them. The gold rush, for all its excitement, was also a story of upheaval and loss. By the dawn of the 20th century, the great rushes had faded. The Klondike's riches were largely exhausted, and Nome's beaches no longer yielded the easy fortunes of the early days. Many stampeders drifted away, returning home with empty pockets or moving on to new frontiers. But Alaska itself had been changed forever. No longer could it be dismissed as an empty land of ice. It had proven itself a land of wealth, a place where fortunes could, at least sometimes, be made. The legacy of the gold rushes lingered in the trails beaten into the mountains, in the abandoned cabins and ghost towns, in the songs and stories that spread across the nation. Alaska had entered the American imagination as a place of extremes, of hardship, of opportunity, of risk and reward. Its economy, once reliant on fur and fish, now had another pillar, and its identity was cemented as a frontier of dreams. The fever may have cooled, but it left a mark that would never fade. The gold rushes, chaotic and brutal though they were, gave Alaska a new role in the story of America. No longer folly, it was now frontier. No longer a distant afterthought, but a land of legend. And as the 20th century began, Alaska's importance would continue to grow. For the world was changing, and this great land, shaped by ice and fire, story and survival, was about to find itself drawn once more into the struggles and ambitions of nations. Chapter 6. World at War, Alaska on Guard. The gold rushes had faded into memory, their trails and boomtowns quieting as fortune seekers moved on to other horizons. Alaska, though forever changed by the fever for gold, settled once more into a rhythm of isolation and endurance. But the 20th century was a different age, and the world itself was tilting toward conflict on a scale never before imagined. In this new struggle, Alaska would find itself thrust into a role far greater than anyone had once dreamed. What had been seen as a frozen frontier of little value now stood revealed as a key outpost in the defense of North America. The Second World War reached into every corner of the globe, and though few would have expected it, Alaska became one of its front lines. Geography was destiny. Alaska's position at the northwest corner of the continent made it a bridge to Asia, closer to Japan than any other part of the United States. Its skies opened toward the Pacific, its seas connected to the Arctic, and its land sat between continents. What had once seemed a disadvantage, its remoteness, now became a strategic prize. The Japanese understood this as well as the Americans. In 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the United States realized that its northern frontier was vulnerable. If Japan could seize Alaska, it would not only threaten the West Coast, but also cut into the supply lines that connected the United States to its allies. Alaska could no longer be ignored. The quiet wilderness became, almost overnight, a militarized zone. Soldiers, engineers, and planners descended on the territory, determined to build defenses in a land as hostile as any enemy. The threat became real in June 1942. Japanese forces, emboldened after their early victories across the Pacific, launched an attack on the Aleutian Islands. They bombed Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, catching many by surprise, and soon after occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska at the far western end of the Aleutian chain. It was the first time since the War of 1812 that foreign troops had occupied American soil. Though the Aleutians were far from the nation's heartland, the shock was immense. The war was no longer distant. It had reached American ground. The Aleutian campaign was brutal in ways that often go unremembered. The islands themselves were as much an enemy as the Japanese. Wind howled endlessly, rain fell in sheets, fog swallowed entire armies. Soldiers found themselves not in tropical jungles, as many expected of the Pacific War, but in landscapes of mud, freezing mist, and barren rock. Supplies were hard to deliver, visibility nearly non-existent, and men often fought more against exposure than against the enemy. In May 1943, American forces launched a desperate effort to retake Attu. The battle was fierce, fought on treeless ridges and sodden tundra. The Japanese defenders, though outnumbered, fought with ferocity, and the Americans struggled in the unfamiliar terrain. Frostbite was rampant, weapons jammed in the wet and cold, and soldiers staggered through waist-deep mud. After weeks of grueling combat, the Americans gained the upper hand. The Japanese, rather than surrender, launched one final banzai charge, a suicidal assault that left the ground littered with bodies. Attu was retaken, but at a terrible cost. More than 1,000 Americans were killed, thousands more wounded, and nearly the entire Japanese garrison annihilated. The following August, American and Canadian forces landed on Kiska, bracing for another bloody battle. But when they advanced through the fog and rain, they found the island empty. The Japanese had slipped away under cover of darkness, evacuating their forces without detection. The campaign was over, though the scars remained. The Aleutian Islands had become a battlefield, a reminder that even the most remote parts of Alaska could not escape the reach of global war. The war did not only touch soldiers. The native peoples of the Aleutians, the Unagan, or Aleut, were caught in the crossfire. Many were forcibly evacuated from their villages by American authorities, moved to camps in southeast Alaska, where they endured poor conditions, illness, and loss. Their homes, left behind, were sometimes destroyed in the fighting. For them, the war brought not only the trauma of invasion, but also the pain of displacement. Another chapter in a long history of being uprooted by forces beyond their control. The Japanese occupation and the battles to reclaim the islands burned into American memory the importance of Alaska's defense. But the war's legacy went far beyond the Aleutians. With the threat of invasion looming, the United States embarked on a massive project to build infrastructure across the territory. Central to this effort was the Alaska Highway. The idea of connecting Alaska to the rest of the continent by road had been floated before, but it was the urgency of war that made it reality. In 1942, construction began on what would become one of the great engineering feats of the war, a road stretching from Dawson Creek in British Columbia through the Yukon to Fairbanks, Alaska. Thousands of soldiers, engineers, and workers hacked their way through forests, swamps, and mountains. They faced mosquitoes in swarms so thick they seemed like clouds, mud that swallowed vehicles whole, and winters that froze equipment solid. Progress was slow, backbreaking, and relentless. Yet within just 8 months, the highway was completed. Over 1,500 miles of rough, hastily built road, linking Alaska to the rest of the continent. The Alaska Highway was more than just a road. It was a lifeline, proof that Alaska could be supplied and defended. Along with it came airfields, barracks, communication lines, and ports. The war transformed Alaska from an isolated outpost into a vital military zone, its landscapes carved by bulldozers and lined with steel. Air routes were established to ferry planes from the continental United States to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, with Alaska serving as the crucial stepping stone. The skies over Fairbanks and Nome filled with aircraft, piloted by Americans and delivered into Soviet hands for use against Germany. For the soldiers stationed there, Alaska was a land of extremes. Many had never seen snow before arriving. Now they endured blizzards that buried entire camps. Equipment froze, food supplies spoiled, and loneliness gnawed at men far from home. Yet bonds were forged in the cold, and a sense of shared purpose kept the work going. The road they built, crude as it was, became a symbol of determination and endurance, much like the stampeders who had trudged the Chilkoot half a century earlier. The war years left Alaska forever changed. No longer a backwater, it had proven its value in defense of the continent. The infrastructure built during the conflict would remain, tying Alaska more closely to the United States. The experience of invasion, of battle on American soil, seared into the national consciousness the importance of this northern frontier. And for Alaskans themselves, the war was a turning point. Native communities bore the burdens of displacement and militarization, yet they also found new opportunities in work and service. Towns swelled with soldiers and workers, economies boomed with military contracts, and the territory, once forgotten, now stood firmly on the map of American importance. The guns eventually fell silent, and peace returned to the Aleutians. But the war had left its mark. Alaska was no longer a curiosity or a gamble. It was a keystone, a reminder that in the age of global conflict, no land was too remote, no frontier too distant. The world had come to Alaska, and Alaska had proven that it mattered. Chapter 7. Statehood and Identity. When the Second World War ended, Alaska was not the same land it had been before the conflict. The war had carved roads through its wilderness, dotted its coasts with airfields, and filled its towns with soldiers and engineers who had come from across the continent. What had once been seen as remote and expendable was now proven to be vital. Alaska mattered, and Alaskans knew it. But recognition as important ground in wartime was not the same as recognition as an equal partner in the nation. For years after the war, Alaska remained a territory, an appendage of the United States, governed by distant authorities, often treated as a colony rather than a part of the Union. The men and women who called it home began to ask, more urgently than ever, why they should remain second-class citizens. Life in post-war Alaska was full of contrasts. On one hand, the wartime boom had left behind roads, military bases, and jobs that had changed the territory's economy. Anchorage grew from a sleepy town into a bustling hub, its population swelling as new arrivals stayed on after the war. Fairbanks expanded, buoyed by military investment and a growing university. Fishing and canning continued as vital industries, and new opportunities opened in construction and trade. Yet alongside this growth was frustration. Territorial status meant that Alaskans could be drafted into the military, pay federal taxes, and obey federal law. But they had no voting representation in Congress and no voice in choosing the president. They were, in their own eyes, Americans without the full rights of Americans. The push for statehood gathered momentum in the years after the war. It was not a new dream. Calls for statehood had been made before, but now it carried a new urgency. Alaskans saw themselves as no less patriotic, no less committed to the Union than their fellow citizens in the lower 48. Their land had been invaded by a foreign enemy. Their sons had fought and died on distant battlefields. Their resources had fed and supplied the war effort. If that was not enough to prove their worth, what was? Yet the road to statehood was not smooth. Opposition was strong, particularly in Congress. Many in Washington saw Alaska as too poor, too sparsely populated, too far away to justify full admission. Some argued it would be a burden on the federal government, a drain of funds without enough tax base to support itself. Others raised geopolitical concerns, fearing that granting statehood so close to the Soviet Union might complicate security. The old mockery of Seward's Folly lingered, reshaped into skepticism that Alaska would ever be more than an outpost of ice and wilderness. Alaskans fought back with passion. They organized campaigns, lobbied politicians, and spread the message that statehood was not a gift, but a right. One of the most powerful symbols of this movement came in 1956, when a group of activists staged the so-called Statehood Constitutional Convention in Fairbanks. Delegates from across the territory gathered to draft a constitution for a state that did not yet exist. They worked with seriousness and skill, producing a document that was praised across the country for its clarity and vision. By creating a model constitution in advance, Alaskans showed they were ready for the responsibilities of statehood. The movement was not only political, but also cultural. Alaskans began to embrace their identity in new ways, seeing themselves as unique but firmly American. They pointed to the richness of their resources, fish, timber, minerals, oil, as proof that the territory could stand on its own feet. They highlighted the strategic importance of Alaska's position in the Cold War, its bases now serving as bulwarks against the Soviet Union just across the Bering Strait. And they spoke of fairness, of the injustice of being treated as less than equal after giving so much to the nation. Support slowly grew, helped by champions in Washington such as Senator Ernest Gruening, who had served as territorial governor and become one of the most vocal advocates for statehood. Another driving force was Bob Bartlett, Alaska's delegate to Congress, who tirelessly pressed the case in the halls of power. Together with grassroots activists back home, they chipped away at the resistance, building alliances and framing Alaska's admission not as a burden, but as an opportunity. The turning point came in the late 1950s. The Cold War heightened awareness of Alaska's importance, and public opinion began to shift. In 1958, after years of debate, Congress finally approved the Alaska Statehood Act. The decision was historic. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the bill, and the path was clear. Alaska would become the 49th state of the Union. On January 3, 1959, the dream became reality. In a ceremony filled with pride, the stars and stripes were raised, now with 49 stars gleaming against the blue. In homes, schools, and gathering places across the territory, Alaskans celebrated, their long struggle finally rewarded. They were no longer second-class citizens, but full participants in the American story. Their voices would be heard in Congress, their votes would count in presidential elections, and their future would be tied not to decisions made far away, but to their own choices as a state. The admission of Alaska carried with it more than celebration. It also brought challenges. Statehood meant new responsibilities. The need to govern vast lands, to balance development with preservation, to manage resources in ways that would sustain rather than deplete. It also meant negotiating the delicate relationship between federal authority and state independence. Alaska was rich in resources, but much of its land remained under federal control. Who would decide how oil, timber, and minerals were used? Who would benefit from the wealth locked beneath the tundra and mountains? These questions sparked debate and tension, shaping the young state's identity as it learned to navigate its place in the Union. The first years of statehood were filled with both optimism and growing pains. Roads and schools were built, industries expanded, and Alaskans reveled in the pride of being recognized as equals. Yet they also confronted the reality that statehood did not erase every challenge. Distance still separated them from the rest of the nation. Costs of living remained high, and economic development was uneven. Native communities continued to face struggles over land rights, sovereignty, and representation, their voices often drowned out in the rush of progress. Independence was cherished, but dependence on federal funds and military investment remained a constant reality. Still, the sense of belonging mattered deeply. Alaskans had fought for statehood not just for practical benefits, but for dignity. They had proven to themselves and the nation that they were capable of shaping their own destiny. That pride became part of the state's fabric, woven into its schools, its politics, its celebrations. Statehood Day became a holiday, a reminder of the long struggle and the moment of triumph. In the larger story of America, Alaska's admission as the 49th state signaled that the frontier was not closed, that the nation was still growing, still embracing new lands and peoples. It was a reminder that identity is not fixed, but forged in struggle and change. For Alaska, statehood was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new chapter, one in which it would continually balance the desire for independence with the realities of federal power, the promise of resources with the responsibility of stewardship, and the richness of its cultural traditions with the demands of modern governance. The stars on the flag may have changed in number, but for Alaskans, the more important change was within. They were no longer a territory at the mercy of distant decisions. They were a state, a people recognized, their identity affirmed. From the days of fire and ice, of migrations and myths, of Russian conquest and American purchase, of gold fever and war, the journey had been long and often harsh. But with statehood, Alaska stepped fully into the Union, carrying with it all the weight of its past and all the promise of its future. Chapter 8: Oil, Power, and Politics. When Alaska became a state in 1959, its people carried with them a deep pride and a sense of possibility. But pride alone could not pave roads or pay teachers. The new state faced daunting financial realities. Much of its land remained under federal control, and its population was small, scattered across vast distances. Industries like fishing, timber, and mining offered some revenue, but not nearly enough to support the infrastructure and services that Alaskans needed. The great question of the young state was simple and pressing. How could Alaska pay its own way? The answer would come not from the forests or the rivers, but from deep beneath the frozen ground of the North Slope. In 1968, Geologists working at Prudhoe Bay, along the icy shores of the Arctic Ocean, struck something that would change Alaska forever. They found oil. Not a trickle, not a small reservoir, but one of the largest oil fields in North America. The scale of the discovery was staggering. Billions of barrels lay buried under tundra and permafrost, a treasure that promised to transform Alaska from a struggling frontier state into one of the richest corners of the nation. The dreams of statehood advocates who had spoken of Alaska's potential suddenly seemed prophetic. The icebox was no longer a joke. It was a vault of black gold. But finding the oil was only the beginning. The question now was how to get it out. The North Slope was remote, frozen for most of the year, and nearly 1,000 miles from the nearest ice-free port. Tankers could not easily reach it, and trucks could not carry oil in such quantities. The solution would have to be audacious. A pipeline stretching from Prudhoe Bay across Alaska's wilderness to the southern port of Valdez, where tankers could load and carry the crude to refineries. It would be one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history, and one of the most controversial. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, or TAPS, was conceived as an 800-mile steel artery, cutting across mountains, rivers, tundra, and forests. From the beginning, it provoked debate. Supporters saw it as the lifeline of the state's economy, the only way to unlock the wealth of the North Slope. Critics feared it would scar Alaska's fragile environment, threatening caribou herds, salmon streams, and the delicate balance of the Arctic. Lawsuits were filed, protests mounted, and for years the project stalled as courts weighed the consequences. The debates revealed the tension at the heart of Alaska's identity. The balance between development and preservation, between using resources and protecting the land that defined the state's character. For Native communities, the pipeline raised additional questions. Much of the land it would cross was claimed by Alaska Natives, whose rights had long been ignored or dismissed. The oil boom forced the nation to confront these claims, leading to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. It was a landmark law, granting Native corporations control of millions of acres and nearly $1 billion in compensation. It was far from perfect, but it marked a turning point. Recognizing that development could not proceed without addressing Native rights. When construction finally began in 1974, it was like nothing Alaska had ever seen. Thousands of workers poured into the state, drawn by high wages and the promise of adventure. Camps sprang up along the route, filled with welders, truck drivers, and engineers. Helicopters buzzed overhead, hauling supplies to remote ridges. Bulldozers carved paths through wilderness that had never known machines. The scale was immense, the challenges constant. Engineers had to design supports that would keep the pipeline above ground in areas of permafrost, where buried pipes would melt the frozen soil and cause collapse. They built elevated sections to allow caribou herds to pass beneath, bridges to cross mighty rivers, and pumping stations to keep the oil moving through the line. The work was dangerous. Winters were long and dark, temperatures plunging far below zero. Summer brought swarms of mosquitoes so thick they could drive men nearly mad. Accidents claimed lives, and the pressure to meet deadlines weighed heavily. Yet the pipeline crept southward, mile by mile, until in 1977, oil finally flowed from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez. The project had taken more than 3 years, cost billions of dollars, and tested the limits of human endurance. But it had been completed, and with it, Alaska was forever changed. The economic transformation was immediate and profound. Oil revenues poured into the state's coffers, dwarfing all previous sources of income. Alaska, once dependent on federal aid, now found itself flush with wealth. Schools were built, roads paved, services expanded. The boom created jobs not only on the North Slope, but across the state, as businesses sprang up to support the industry. Anchorage grew into a modern city. Fairbanks thrived, and even remote communities felt the ripple effects of prosperity. The small, struggling state had become, almost overnight, one of the richest in the nation on a per capita basis. But wealth brought new dilemmas. How should the money be spent? Should it go to immediate needs, roads, schools, hospitals, or should it be saved for future generations? The debates were fierce, and out of them came one of Alaska's most innovative political experiments. The Alaska Permanent Fund. Established in 1976, before the first oil flowed, it set aside a portion of oil revenues in a savings account, intended to benefit Alaskans long after the wells had run dry. Over time, the fund grew into billions of dollars, and its annual dividends, paid directly to every resident, became a symbol of the state's unique relationship to its resources. In Alaska, oil wealth was not just for corporations or governments. It was shared with the people themselves. Yet the wealth also carried dangers. Boomtown economics meant rapid growth, followed by uncertainty. Oil prices rose and fell with global markets, and with each fluctuation, Alaska's fortunes rose and fell too. Critics warned that the state was becoming too dependent on a single resource, that it was living on borrowed time. Others pointed to the environmental costs. Oil spills like the later Exxon Valdez disaster revealed the risks of transporting so much crude through fragile ecosystems. Conservationists argued that the rush for profit threatened the very wilderness that made Alaska unique. Politics in Alaska became dominated by oil. Campaigns were fought over drilling rights, pipeline regulations, and revenue distribution. Governors rose and fell on their handling of the industry. Federal and state authorities clashed over who controlled the land, the leases, and the profits. Native corporations navigated the challenges of balancing cultural traditions with the demands of the oil economy. The pipeline was not only a physical artery, but a political one, carrying with it the lifeblood of the state in the endless debates over how it should be managed. For ordinary Alaskans, oil brought both opportunity and complexity. The dividends from the Permanent Fund provided annual relief, sometimes used for essentials, sometimes for luxuries. Jobs in oil fields offered high wages, but required long, grueling shifts far from home. Communities prospered, but also grappled with the social challenges of sudden wealth. Rising costs of living, substance abuse, and the strain of rapid change. Oil was both blessing and burden, a source of pride and a constant reminder of vulnerability. Through it all, Alaska's identity continued to evolve. Once dismissed as folly, then celebrated as frontier, it was now defined as an energy powerhouse, a land whose black gold fueled not only its own prosperity, but also the engines of the nation. Its debates over independence, resources, and federal control echoed in every decision about drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Every argument about revenue sharing, every question of how to balance economic growth with environmental stewardship. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were measured in billions of dollars, in the future of communities, in the legacy left to generations yet unborn. The discovery at Prudhoe Bay and the construction of the pipeline had rewritten Alaska's destiny. The state that once struggled to pay its way had become wealthy beyond imagination. But wealth, like oil, is slippery, hard to hold, and fraught with risk. The promise of oil had been fulfilled, but it had also bound Alaska's future to forces beyond its control. Global markets, federal policies, environmental limits. The dream of independence was now tied, paradoxically, to the very resource that made the state rich, but also kept it tethered to the wider world. From ice and fire to gold and oil, Alaska's story had always been one of transformation, of sudden upheavals that reshaped its course. In the oil age, the stakes were higher, the rewards greater, and the challenges sharper. And as the pipeline carried its endless stream of crude from the Arctic to the sea, it carried with it the hopes and fears of a state still learning how to balance the wealth of its land with the soul of its people. Chapter 9. Nature's Kingdom. The oil wealth that surged through Alaska after the discovery of Prudhoe Bay gave the young state resources it had never known before. Roads were built, cities grew, and money flowed into schools, hospitals, and homes. But with prosperity came a question that was as old as Alaska itself. What should be done with the land? From the earliest migrations across Beringia to the pipeline of the 20th century, survival had always depended on a balance between taking from the earth and respecting its limits. Now, with machines that could carve mountains and wells that could drain underground seas, that balance was more fragile than ever. At the same time, the land itself stood as a wonder unmatched in the world, and people across the nation began to see Alaska not only as a resource, but as a treasure to be protected. Alaska's wilderness was legendary. Vast mountains, glaciers tumbling into the sea, rivers running wild and free, forests stretching farther than the eye could see. Wildlife thrived in numbers, and diversity found nowhere else in the United States. Caribou roamed in great herds across the tundra. Moose wandered the forests, towering above the brush. Bears, both brown and polar, commanded respect as masters of their realms. Eagles circled high over rivers teeming with salmon. To many Americans, Alaska became the last true frontier, a place where nature still reigned and where the human hand had not yet erased the wild. That vision was enshrined in the creation of national parks and refuges. Even before statehood, areas like Mount McKinley National Park, later renamed Denali, were set aside to preserve their beauty and wildlife. After statehood, the movement grew stronger, fueled by the realization that Alaska held some of the most pristine landscapes left on Earth. Conservationists argued that these lands were not only Alaskan, but American, part of a shared heritage that must be safeguarded for future generations. Visitors who came to see glaciers calving into icy waters or to hike among towering peaks returned home with stories of a place almost mythical in its grandeur. But Alaska was not only myth and beauty. It was also a storehouse of resources, oil, gas, minerals, timber that promised jobs and revenue. Industry saw the same mountains and valleys not as treasures to be preserved, but as opportunities to be developed. For every voice calling for protection, another demanded access. The clash between conservation and industry became one of the defining struggles of Alaska's modern history. The debate reached a crescendo in the 1970s and 1980s. On one side stood those who believed Alaska's vastness could absorb development without losing its essence. They argued that the wealth of oil and minerals was the foundation of the state's economy, that without it, Alaska would slip into poverty and dependence. They pointed to the pipeline as proof that industry could coexist with wildlife, noting that caribou herds still roamed despite the steel artery crossing their paths. On the other side stood conservationists, both within Alaska and across the nation, who saw a danger greater than immediate profit. They feared that once the wilderness was open to industry, it could never be truly closed again. Roads would fragment habitats, spills would poison rivers, and the very wildness that defined Alaska would be lost forever. The battle came to a head with the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, signed into law in 1980 by President Jimmy Carter. The act was sweeping, setting aside more than 100 million acres for preservation in national parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas. It was one of the greatest land conservation measures in history, doubling the size of the national park system and ensuring that vast stretches of Alaska would remain untouched by development. To conservationists, it was a triumph, a recognition that some parts of the earth must remain wild. To industry and many Alaskans, it felt like a federal overreach, locking away lands that could have supported jobs and growth. The tension between local control and national interest, between development and preservation, burned hotter than ever. These tensions were not abstract. They played out in real places with real consequences. In the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, known as ANWR, battles raged over whether oil drilling should be allowed. The refuge, stretching across the northeastern corner of the state, was home to caribou, polar bears, and migratory birds. For decades, it became a symbol, a flashpoint where the nation debated the meaning of wilderness itself. To drill there was, for some, to secure America's energy independence. To protect it was, for others, to honor the last unbroken frontier. Year after year, the argument flared, shifting with the winds of politics and markets, never fully resolved. Meanwhile, Alaskans themselves lived in the middle of the struggle. Many relied on resource development for their livelihoods, working on oil rigs, in mines, or in logging camps. Others depended on the land for subsistence, hunting caribou or fishing salmon to feed their families. The question of conservation versus development was not simply philosophical, but practical, touching every life. Could jobs and preservation coexist? Could the wealth of the land be used without destroying its spirit? These were not easy questions, and they remain unsettled to this day. As the 20th century drew to a close, another force entered the debate, one even greater than industry or conservation. Climate change began to reveal its presence in Alaska more visibly than almost anywhere else in the world. The Arctic warmed at twice the global average, and Alaska stood on the front lines of the transformation. Glaciers that had towered for centuries began to retreat, their icy tongues pulling back into valleys. Sea ice that had once sealed the Arctic Ocean for much of the year grew thinner and smaller. Villages built on permafrost saw the ground beneath them soften and shift, foundations cracking as the frozen earth melted. For communities along the coast, the changes were not distant warnings, but immediate threats. Storm surges, once held back by protective sea ice, struck with new force, eroding land and washing away homes. Some villages faced the prospect of relocation, their ancestral lands no longer safe to inhabit. Hunters found traditional patterns disrupted as caribou migrations shifted and marine mammals grew scarcer or harder to reach. What had once been a reliable cycle of seasons was becoming unpredictable, forcing adaptation at a pace faster than tradition could easily allow. The melting of the Arctic also drew new eyes to Alaska. As sea ice receded, shipping routes through the Arctic Ocean became more viable, opening paths that once had been the realm of explorers' dreams. Nations and corporations looked northward, imagining shorter routes between continents, new fisheries, and untapped reserves of oil and gas beneath the ocean floor. Once again, Alaska stood at the crossroads of development and preservation. Its future tied not only to its own choices, but to global forces far beyond its control. The land itself bore witness to all these changes. Denali rose above the clouds, its peak catching the first light of dawn. Glaciers still thundered into fjords, though they receded year by year. Bears still fished for salmon in roaring rivers, eagles still wheeled above forests. And in those moments it seemed that nature's kingdom remained unbroken. But the cracks were visible, the fragility undeniable. Alaska was both a sanctuary and a warning, a place where the consequences of human ambition and the power of the natural world met head-on. For Alaskans, the challenge was and remains finding balance. Oil revenues provided wealth, but conservation ensured identity. Development promised jobs, but wilderness promised meaning. Climate change threatened both, reshaping the land faster than politics could respond. The debates over pipelines, parks, and permafrost were not just about Alaska, but about the larger human story. How to live on a planet that is both generous and finite, both resilient and vulnerable. In the end, Alaska's nature is its greatest inheritance. From the tundra to the rainforests of the southeast, from the Aleutian volcanoes to the frozen Arctic Ocean, it is a land that captures imaginations and demands respect. To walk among its mountains or sail its icy seas is to feel both small and connected, to recognize that there are still places where the wild endures. But it is also to realize that such endurance is not guaranteed. The kingdom of nature is powerful, yet it can be wounded, and Alaska stands as both its crown and its battleground. The clash between conservationists and industry, the struggle to preserve wilderness while using resources, and the looming shadow of climate change are not separate stories. They are one story, woven into the very fabric of Alaska's identity. A state born of fire and ice, enriched by gold and oil, must now decide what it will leave behind. A scarred land stripped of its essence, or a kingdom of nature preserved amid change. And as the glaciers melt and the debates rage, the answer grows more urgent with every passing season. Chapter 10. Alaska Today. Alaska stands now at a crossroads, shaped by the weight of its history and the power of its land. From the ancient peoples who crossed Beringia to the oil workers on the North Slope, from Russian traders to stampeders chasing gold, every chapter has left its mark. Yet Alaska is not only a place of memory. It is alive, restless, changing. Its people and its land still wrestle with the same questions that have always defined it. How to live in balance with a wilderness both fragile and fierce. How to thrive without destroying what makes this place unlike anywhere else on Earth. How to claim a future without losing the past. One of the most striking transformations in modern Alaska has been the cultural revival of native traditions. For much of its history under Russian and American rule, those traditions were dismissed, suppressed, or ignored. Children were taken from villages to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages. Ceremonies and dances were discouraged or outlawed, stories mocked as superstition. But traditions that had endured ice ages and invasions did not vanish so easily. In recent decades, they have returned with renewed strength. Across the state, languages once on the edge of extinction are being taught again to children. Elders, who for years carried their knowledge quietly, now share it openly, passing down songs, stories, and skills. Festivals bring communities together to dance in masks, to drum, to honor the spirits of animals and ancestors. Carvers raise totem poles once more, their designs proclaiming the survival of clans and families. Artists weave ancient patterns into modern works, blending heritage with innovation. For many young Alaska natives, identity is no longer a burden, but a source of pride. They look to their elders not as relics of the past, but as guides to the future. This revival is not only cultural, but political. Native corporations, created under the Settlement Act of 1971, now play major roles in the state's economy, managing lands, resources, and investments. Villages that once felt forgotten now assert their voices in debates over development, preservation, and governance. The legacy of dispossession is not erased, but the determination to shape Alaska's destiny rather than be shaped by others is stronger than ever. Modern Alaska cannot be understood without recognizing this resurgence of native power and tradition, a thread binding past to present with resilience and pride. Yet, alongside revival lies tension, as it always has. Alaska's wealth still flows largely from its resources, from the oil that fuels engines and funds government coffers, from fisheries that feed millions beyond its borders, from minerals buried in mountains. The promise of jobs and revenue tempts every new generation of leaders to push deeper into the wilderness, to open new lands, to drill, to mine, to cut. At the same time, conservationists and many Alaskans resist, knowing that once the wild is broken, it cannot be mended. The debate between development and preservation is not a distant memory of the pipeline era, but a daily reality. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge remains at the heart of this struggle. For decades, it has been the stage for battles over oil drilling, the symbol of the clash between economic promise and environmental sanctity. Supporters argue that development brings jobs, energy security, and revenue for schools and services. Opponents counter that the refuge is one of the last truly untouched wildernesses, home to caribou herds, polar bears, and migratory birds, and that its destruction would be a loss not only for Alaska, but for the world. Each administration in Washington seems to tip the scale one way or the other, opening or closing the door, and Alaskans live with the uncertainty of a future balanced between drill rigs and tundra flowers. This tension reaches beyond oil. Logging in the Tongass National Forest, mining in the Brooks Range, even large-scale fishing in delicate waters all spark fierce debates. Industry promises prosperity, conservationists warn of ruin, and communities weigh immediate needs against long-term survival. For native villages, the question is often sharper. Development may bring money, but it also threatens subsistence traditions that have endured for thousands of years. To lose the salmon runs or the caribou migrations is to lose more than food. It is to lose identity, stories, and the continuity of life itself. At the same time, Alaska's role in America's future is expanding in ways few could have imagined even a generation ago. In an age of climate change and global tension, Alaska has become more than a frontier. It is a front line. The Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else, and in Alaska the effects are visible in real time. Glaciers retreat with astonishing speed. Permafrost melts, undermining homes, roads, and pipelines. Villages face rising seas and violent storms, forcing some to abandon ancestral lands and seek new homes inland. The patterns of fish and game shift, disrupting subsistence and industry alike. For scientists, Alaska is both a warning and a laboratory, a place where the future of the planet is written in melting ice and shifting seasons. Geopolitically, too, Alaska is no longer remote. Across the Bering Strait lies Russia, its military bases and ambitions close enough to see on a clear day. To the north, the Arctic Ocean, once locked in ice, is opening, drawing the interest of nations eager for new shipping routes and untapped resources. The United States has recognized this, expanding military presence in Alaska, building radar stations, and conducting Arctic exercises. The same land that once seemed useless and barren is now prized as a strategic frontier, a shield, and a doorway to the world. In the calculus of geopolitics, Alaska has become not just America's last frontier, but its first line of defense. Energy, too, keeps Alaska central in the nation's mind. Oil still flows through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, though at lower volumes than its peak. Renewable energy projects are slowly taking shape, harnessing wind, rivers, and tides. Debates rage over whether Alaska should remain bound to fossil fuels or lead in new energy frontiers. The choices made here carry weight far beyond its borders, shaping not only the state's future but America's approach to energy, environment, and climate. For Alaskans, these debates are not abstract. They play out in everyday life. A fisherman wonders whether salmon runs will sustain his children's future. An oil worker weighs the stability of his job against the volatility of global markets. A village elder warns that the ice is no longer safe in spring, that hunting grounds are changing. A young native student learns her ancestral language in the morning and studies climate science in the afternoon, seeing both as essential to survival. The old and the new, the traditional and the modern, the local and the global, all collide in Alaska today. And through it all, the land endures, magnificent and demanding. Denali still towers above the Alaska Range, a peak that humbles even the proudest. The northern lights still shimmer across the winter skies, green and red curtains of fire dancing above villages wrapped in snow. Bears still fish in rivers swollen with salmon, whales still breach in icy waters, and in those moments it feels as if nothing has changed. Yet beneath the beauty lies fragility, and beneath the endurance lies urgency. Alaska's choices now will shape not only its own destiny, but the story of how humanity lives with a changing planet. Alaska today is a place of revival and conflict, of pride and uncertainty. Its native traditions rise again with strength. Its industries still pull wealth from the earth. Its people wrestle with questions of identity, fairness, and survival. It is both shield and resource, both wilderness and battleground. To walk its land or sail its seas is to feel history pressing against the present, to sense that here, at the edge of the continent, the great questions of our age, how to balance growth with preservation, how to live with change, how to honor the past while building the future, are not theoretical but immediate. The journey of Alaska has always been about extremes: fire and ice, survival and loss, gold and oil, wilderness and industry. Today, those extremes remain, sharpened by new forces of climate and politics. And yet, in the midst of uncertainty, Alaska endures, not as folly, not as curiosity, but as a vital part of America's story and a mirror of its future. What Alaska becomes in the coming years may well tell us what the nation itself is willing to become. A people who can exploit without thought, or a people who can balance wealth with wisdom, power with humility, ambition with respect for the land. Alaska is no longer a frontier waiting to be claimed. It is a homeland, a resource, a sanctuary, a challenge. It is America's past and present, and more than ever, it is America's future. Epilogue: The Last Frontier. Alaska has always been more than a place on a map. To Americans, it has long stood as an idea, a symbol, a canvas on which dreams and fears are painted in bold strokes. From the first whispers of gold in its rivers to the roar of oil through its pipelines. From the ancient songs of its native peoples to the thunder of bombers crossing its skies. Alaska has captured imaginations not only because of what it is, but because of what it represents. It is the edge of the known, the farthest reach of the continent, a reminder that beyond the fences and highways of modern life, there is still a land where nature rules and survival is not guaranteed. Part of Alaska's hold on the American mind comes from its sheer size. Twice as large as Texas, stretching from temperate rainforests in the southeast to the frozen tundra of the north. It seems to contain a dozen countries within its borders. Its distances are measured not in miles, but in days of travel. Its mountains higher and more rugged than any in the lower 48. Its rivers wider and wilder. Its winters darker and colder. To imagine Alaska is to imagine extremes, a place where the ordinary rules no longer apply. In that sense, it is both intimidating and inspiring, a land that humbles even as it tempts. Alaska is also a land of contradictions. It has brought both survival and death, riches and ruin. For every prospector who struck gold, hundreds went home broke or never went home at all. For every barrel of oil that funded schools and dividends, spills and melting ice reminded people of the cost. The state embodies the American pursuit of wealth, yet it also embodies the price of that pursuit. To speak of Alaska is to speak of abundance and fragility in the same breath, of opportunities as vast as its landscapes and dangers as sharp as its storms. And yet, it is precisely this tension that makes Alaska endure in the imagination. It is not tamed, not settled in the way so much of the country has been. Towns may grow, roads may stretch farther, but wilderness still dominates. To stand in Denali National Park and see no human mark on the horizon is to glimpse a world that feels older than time. To watch the northern lights dance across the sky is to feel that the earth itself still holds secrets. In Alaska, the modern world and the ancient coexist, and that coexistence speaks to something deep in the American spirit. The longing for freedom, for space, for the chance to test oneself against something greater. The legacy of Alaska as the great land is not only in its resources or its scenery, but in its role as a mirror. Each generation has seen in Alaska what it most desired or most feared. For Russians, it was furs and empire. For Americans in the 1800s, it was folly turned into fortune. For gold seekers, it was destiny glittering in a pan. For soldiers in the Second World War, it was a shield against invasion. For oilmen in the 20th century, it was prosperity flowing beneath frozen ground. And for today's America, it is both a storehouse of energy and a warning of climate's fragility, both a homeland for revival and a stage for global competition. But beyond politics, beyond economics, beyond even survival, Alaska endures in imagination because it remains untamed. In a nation that often measures itself by growth and control, Alaska resists being fully mastered. Its storms still ground plains, its glaciers still carve valleys, its bears still roam where they will. Its native peoples, though changed by centuries of pressure, continue to draw strength from traditions that link them to a land older than borders. Alaska defies neat categories. It is not only wilderness, not only resource, not only frontier. It is all of these, held together by a scale that dwarfs the ordinary. To call it the last frontier is not simply to say it was the last state admitted before Hawaii, or the last great expanse of wilderness in the Union. It is to acknowledge that it embodies something rare. The sense that the story is not finished, that exploration and discovery are still possible, that there are still places where human ambition meets resistance and must adapt. The frontier, in the American imagination, was never only about land. It was about possibility, about the horizon always just beyond reach. Alaska keeps that horizon alive. In the end, the enduring legacy of Alaska is that it refuses to be one thing. It is survival and wealth, wilderness and industry, ancient tradition and modern experiment. It is a place where a prospector's cabin can stand in the shadow of an oil rig, where a totem pole rises beside a satellite dish, where a subsistence hunter's kayak glides past a cruise ship. It is contradictions like these that make it real, and that keep it from being reduced to a simple story. Alaska still captures the American imagination because it reminds us of both our power and our limits. It shows what humans can achieve. Pipelines across permafrost, cities in the snow. And it shows what humans cannot control. Melting ice, shifting caribou. Storms that erase roads in a night. It holds the possibility of wealth and the certainty of struggle, the promise of future and the weight of past. To speak of Alaska is to speak of America itself, distilled into sharper edges and broader landscapes. The great land is not finished. Its rivers still run wild. Its mountains still rise higher than clouds. Its people still live with resilience and pride. Whether as homeland or frontier, as resource or sanctuary, Alaska endures. And as long as it does, the imagination will continue to turn north, to the edge of the continent, where the lights dance in the winter sky and the horizon still whispers of what might yet be found.